Hello, hello, hello. This is the Reconsider Simon podcast, coming to you live and direct from the Reconsider Simon HQ. Incredibly large building and operation. Lots of people working on this podcast. It's not just me. Obviously, I'm joking. But today, specifically going to be concentrating on the lost civilization of Atlantis, and also a little bit on Lemuria as well, which is a civilization that people tend to think of as existing before Atlantis. So we're going to look into that just briefly. So I'm going to be asking very profound and deep questions. What was Atlantis? What was Lemuria? How do these two civilizations potentially intersect? Some perceive them as being different civilizations at different times, but some recent information has surfaced that indicates maybe they intersected, maybe they're existing simultaneously and are actually interacting in some way. Over the many, many years of history, the sands of time, you have individuals like Plato, who talked about Atlantis, Pliny the Elder, quite a mad name, never heard him before, Proclus, Thomas More, Francis Bacon, Ignatius Donnelly, Helena Blavatsky, and Edgar Cayce. These are some of the characters that have basically popularized Atlantis over the last, few hundred years, some more so than others, particularly in the present day. Much of the mainstream world tend to view Atlantis as just being a complete myth, a legend, something to be disregarded. There's a general agenda out there that where we are at the moment is the most in terms of technology, the most in terms of understanding and knowledge. And there are certain sectors of, I would guess, political establishment, academia establishment that just view now as being the height of human perfection, the height of human ingenuity. But is that correct? I would question that ethos. I would question those thoughts. I would say no. I think there have been probably multiple occasions in this strange reality that we find ourselves in, where humanity has kind of peaked in development, and unfortunately those civilizations have been reset for various reasons or another. And I would say that Atlantis and Lemuria are one of those civilizations. But in terms of this podcast and what I'm concentrating on, obviously again it's going to be majority on Atlantis and some information that intersects with Lemuria and some of their historical activities, things that went on. But the majority of the information I'm going to be imparting to you all today has come from individuals like Sarah Breskman, Edgar Cayce, Delores Cannon. So I guess this is a lot of regression information that's come through. In terms of Edgar Cayce, he's always perceived as being the sleeping mystic, sleeping prophet. So maybe you people perceive that as being channeled information. I'm sure one day there'll be a time on a podcast where I won't mention Delores Cannon, but unfortunately today is not one of those days. I'm going to mention her again. She is the creator of QHHT, which is quantum hypnosis therapy. And she was very much into hypnotherapy and ended up regressing clients, found that she could heal various ailments, physical ailments and spiritual problems that people had just through delving into their past lives and seeing how that interacted with their present life. And she found that the clients that she was getting and some of the information, it wasn't just looking at people's past lives within the earth realm, within, reincarnation, within this earth plane. It was happening on a more galactic level. So she started to get this quite fantastical, if that's a word, information from the whole galactic plane in terms of reincarnation. So she was deciphering information from her clients of people being different beings on different planets or dimensions. And considering, where we are now, maybe in certain circles, people are quite comfortable with this sort of information. But just imagine when this information was coming forward during the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Very much the collective consciousness was very closed off from this kind of information. So must have been really wild to start having this information coming through her clients. And so she kind of created the whole protocols of QHHT and became very, very popular. And then this brings into another individual that I'm going to be discussing on this podcast called Sarah Breskman. And she's very much a practitioner of Delores Cannon's work and has basically kind of taken on the mantle of some of the information that's kind of coming through. I mean, anyone can train the protocols of QHHT, and there's therapists all over the world doing this technique. So if you wanted to do it yourself, there's lots of people around to help you. But yeah, I recently read one of her books, Sarah Breskman's books, specifically to do with Atlantis, and it was just one of those books that I just ended up going through incredibly quickly. It was called A Hypnotist's Journey to Atlantis. And it was just so simply written. I just devoured it pretty much within a couple of days. Really fascinating information. So I'm going to be discussing that. And then Edgar Cayce, I read his book a long time ago. Not that long, probably about 4 years ago, 3 years ago now. And the book's called There Is a River, and it's a biography, and it was actually written by a friend of his called Thomas Seguri. I'm probably butchering that as usual. But yeah, he's very much perceived as being the sleeping prophet, and he was able to find that he was able to go into a trance-like state, and people were able to ask him questions. He was somehow tapping into some kind of higher power. And he was able to provide people with healing information. So if people had these quite terminal diseases or illnesses that kind of mainstream medicine just wasn't able to tackle and help them with, and to give them relief, Edgar Cayce in these trance-like states was able to impart sometimes quite complex medicinal information to help them heal, to help them recover. And he did this for thousands of people and helped thousands of people when he was doing this. Fascinatingly, it wasn't just medical information that kind of came through when he was in a trance-like state. He had people coming to him and paying him as well to discover information about the Bible, and also starting to ask questions about ancient civilizations. And whatever force that Edgar Cayce was tapping into was able to give us really expansive, quite deep knowledge about certain historical events, and particularly Atlantis and Lemuria. And even some of the people he was healing, he was discovering that they had past lives, previous experiences in Atlantis. At the time, he actually found this quite difficult because he was a devout Christian. So reincarnation wasn't really in his ballpark. He was very much into the Bible, would read it every single year, and would even teach at Sunday schools. So some of the information that came through was really challenging for him, and he really, really struggled actually for the majority of his life with his role in what he was doing sometimes. So for the majority of this audio piece, a lot of the information in discussing concepts of Atlantis and Lemuria is coming from these key individuals. It's going to be the Edgar Cayce, Delores Cannon, and Sarah Breskman. But I'm also going to discuss Plato as well. Obviously, he's a very famous historical Greek philosopher. And to my knowledge and research, he appears to be the first, I guess, individual in our known history. Obviously, there's probably a lot of lost history that we've forgotten about. But yeah, he's one of the very first key characters that starts to talk about historical events of Atlantis and the fact that this civilization was lost many, many thousands of years ago. What I find fascinating is that some of the challenges that our society is going through now, and obviously there's a real heightened sense of chaos and things are gathering pace and energy. There's so many things going on. I don't have to tell you that. But some of the problems we're facing were quite similar. They're echoes of what happened and occurred in Atlantis and also Lemuria. And according to some of these individuals, some of this channeled information, it's sort of stating that many of the people who were involved in Atlantis and Lemuria at that particular time, towards the end of those civilizations, are reincarnated now as they kind of re-experiencing the same thing, the same problems. But hopefully, touch wood, humanity will transcend these problems and then be into a higher state of consciousness. Particularly with Sarah Breskman's work, much of the regression information that came through her clients it's discussing concepts that are quite similar to, modern day pharmaceutical industry, mainstream science, and some of the issues we've come across recently, particularly in terms of like medication, racism, the idea of being above particular groups of people, sexism. And I know there's a whole realm of our current modern day situation where some of these problems have been artificially inflated. That is also going on. But there's a whole host of situations that played out in Atlantis that are also playing out now in the current time. So again, there's this feeling of unfinished business that we're all here to really help humanity push it over the line, to break out from this constant cycle of like resets, hopefully to break out of that boom and bust cyclical nature that we've existed in for, I guess, for a very long time. I guess, again, because we're going to be discussing some particularly prevalent conspiratorial scenario situations that, are quite recent within the last, 3 years, 4 years. I'm going to use some coded language for particular platforms that have these weird AI bots that tend to censor depending on certain words. So I'm going to be talking about stuff like cases of the bat sniffles and injections to do with that. So hopefully that's coded enough, but not too obscure that you don't understand what I'm talking about. So in terms of scholars and writers who have written and popularized concepts to do with Atlantis, I've already mentioned the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. He's very much the primary source. And what you find over the years, the hundreds of years, that other writers and scholars have kind of built on his concepts, reinterpreted it, but also came across their own information. One of the first was an individual called Cranta in 300 BC. He's another philosopher, and actually he was a student of one of Plato's pupils. And so there's a very quite direct connection to Plato itself. He claims to have visited Egypt and actually had access to some of the records of ancient Egypt, who actually discussed some of the Atlantean concepts. Unfortunately, a lot of his work apparently didn't survive, but other writers have actually mentioned his work and some of his findings, throughout history. And the next one, I mentioned him earlier, bit of a crazy name, Pliny the Elder. He was active from 27 to 79 AD. He was a Roman author and a naturalist, and was mentioned in an encyclopedia called The Natural History. And yeah, he went on to discuss some of Plato's account, that he very much popularized again some of the concepts, I guess, within ancient Rome. So I guess this is a running theme that you would have some of these scholars, academics, or however you want to describe them, writers, who basically revive some of these ideas of Atlantis. Maybe they got forgotten, but then they rewrite the story, the history, and it just popularizes it within the consciousness of humanity again. And another one of those individuals, might butcher his name as usual, as Proclus, and he was 412 to 485 AD. And he was a Greek Neoplatonist philosopher, and he very much expanded on some of Plato's knowledge, and again referenced some records that he discovered in Egypt as well. So he obviously built upon Plato's existing knowledge. So now we're getting a bit closer to modern times and also to names that I can pronounce better. A guy called Thomas More, and he was active from 1478 to 1535. And again, he just popularized the idea of Atlantis around that particular time. He wrote a book called Utopia, which is a fictional society which is very much based on some of the stories and concepts of Atlantis. But yeah, so his work is a little bit different because it's more fiction based, but potentially based off real events in terms of Atlantis. Then the next one, you've probably heard this name. Everyone's heard this name. He was the man who invented bacon, Francis Bacon. Obviously, that's a joke. He was active in 1561 and 1626. And he wrote a piece of work called New Atlantis. Again, it was a fictional story and an island story, and it discussed the ideas of this utopian civilization. And a lot of these scholars, a lot of these writers tend to write about Atlantis in glowing terms, like it's some utopian society, which maybe in part it was, but there is information that I'm going to be discussing later where it starts to view Atlantis maybe less than great sometimes. Oh God, I thought I was on the home stretch with names. I forgot about this individual. Ignatius Donnelly. Apologies to all the well-read, highly educated people who scream that I got that wrong. But he was active from about 1831 to 1891. Again, very much popularized Atlantis for the time. His book was called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And again, very much influential in popularizing the whole Atlantis speculation. Then there's Helena Blavatsky, 1875 to 1891. And she wrote a book called Atlantis, the Secret Doctrine. And she very much described Atlantis and its advanced civilization, its technology, and also its advanced esoteric knowledge. And finally, the man, the myth, the legend, Edgar Cayce, 1877. He was born and died 1945. And I'm going to be talking about him at length and some of the information in terms of Atlantis and Lemuria. But I guess he's slightly different to all the other individuals because he's not a writer, he's not a philosopher, he's not an academic. He was just a guy who was able to go into really deep trance, who was able to tap into a higher intelligence, a higher force, who was able to impart quite deep, intense medical knowledge and deep metaphysical knowledge through his various civilizations. So yeah, very, very unique character. And the only reason we have his information because someone needs to be there to transcribe what he was saying. He was in a deep trance, so he wasn't able to do it. And he would never really remember any of the information he spoke about. So someone always needs to be there to write what he was saying down. The major commonality of all those individuals I just discussed was the fact that they had a heartbeat at one point and they were alive. The next person I'm going to quote is actually a robot. I'm going to utilize AI to see what their opinion is in terms of, their knowledge and understanding of Atlantis. It goes like this. There is no historical or scientific evidence to support the existence of either Lemuria or Atlantis as real, physical locations. Both are largely considered to be mythical or hypothetical constructs. However, within the realms of mythology, esoteric traditions, and speculative fiction, timelines and characteristics of Lemuria and Atlantis vary. So there you go. I mean, that response isn't wholly surprising because this is essentially like a distilled mouthpiece of the entirety of mainstream's thought and opinion on Atlantis, which tends to ridicule it and not really take it seriously. But I thought I'd just throw that in there because it is a relevant piece of information, a relevant source of information in terms of looking at all avenues and in people's perception of Atlantis and Lemuria and the history behind it. Now moving on to back to Plato, who's very much the individual who popularized the idea of Atlantis, particularly. There are probably other historical figures that maybe have just been lost in the sands of time that probably try to carry on discussing their history, but they're gone and lost forever, I guess. But yeah, in terms of Plato, again, he was an ancient Greek philosopher from 428 to 348 BC, and he was living in Athens. And there were two dialogues really that actually surfaced some of the ideas to do with Atlantis. One of the dialogue where he started to discuss Atlantis was Timaeus, and the second one was Critias. And yeah, he was just basically saying that Atlantis existed 9,000 years before his time. And he used it very much within his philosophy as to be able to teach moral lessons in terms of the nature of cyclical civilizations, how they all have this similar arc in the way they start and then they end in some kind of moral quandary and dysregulation, I guess. And also used Atlantis to just highlight the importance of virtue and consequences and moral decay, corruption and wealth and power. And this all kind of ties into our potential understanding of Atlantis and why in the end it fell. In the dialogue of Timaeus, Atlantis is introduced through a character called Critias, and he regales the stories of hearing about Atlantis from Egyptian priests. And within the dialogue, it's claimed that the actual physical location of Atlantis is located beyond the pillars of Heracles, which now is the modern day Strait of Gibraltar, roughly around there. And for that particular time, they were claiming that Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined, so a vast land space. The whole topic of Atlantis's location is shrouded in mystery. In terms of Plato, he's discussing how it's around the modern Strait of Gibraltar, which is, the very tip of Europe, kind of where Spain is, overlooking to Africa. And I've heard so many different locations, like near Ireland. It generally tends to be potentially around the Atlantic Ocean. And I know I'm going to be talking about Sarah Breskman's work later, and they mark it as being quite close to like Florida, that kind of area, but still in the Atlantic Ocean area. And I've also heard people discussing it being around the Caribbean area, or if you're in America, the Caribbean. Anyway, let's get back to Plato. From his point of view, the island was rich in resources and precious metals and was blessed with a really huge, diverse wildlife. And then in terms of like agriculture, the ground was really, really rich. And so it meant they had abundance in agriculture and food. He also confirms the Atlanteans were very technologically advanced, which you hear a lot of. Their real obsession with science and technology. And also had a really, really powerful military that were actually capable of building incredibly impressive structures and would conduct these huge military campaigns with this, varying destructive technologies. In terms of Atlantis's hierarchy and political landscape, Plato perceived the actual area being split up into 10 separate kingdoms, and each kingdom was ruled by a particular king, and they were all descendant of a god, Poseidon, and also immortal Cleito as well. Eventually, because of the moral decay and how far Atlantis had fallen, the reason for Atlantis' destruction was due to the gods punishing that particular civilization. And so elicited a huge range of catastrophic natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, which eventually led to the whole island being submerged in the ocean. So that's a brief summary of, what Plato and his understandings of Atlantis. I'm now going to move on to more kind of the woo-woo side of some of the information of Atlantis. Much of the information is, I guess you would call it channeled information. So it could be a downloaded info that's just kind of come from the ether. It could be in terms of psychic visions or psychic audio hearings. Or through regression. And this brings into the ideas of quantum healing hypnosis technique, which I've mentioned on this podcast a million times. And again, like I've mentioned a million times, just for if you're new and haven't really heard of it before, it's a popular method that was created by Delores Cannon, who's now unfortunately died. I think she died in 2014. But she's the creator, she's the founder of the QHHT movement. What this hypnosis technique allows you to do is to connect with your higher connection, your inner divine self, in a way, your higher self. And through that, you can then ask your inner divine self questions. And so a lot of the questions tended to be surrounding, past or parallel lives or future lives, different incarnations, which could have happened on Earth, or they could happen in a completely different solar system or a different dimension. And a lot of the time, people go through this hypnotic process to try and uncover particular health conditions or emotional conditions that are unfortunately suffering in their current life, and figuring out whether there's an influence from a past life that is kind of causing it, and be able to clear it and obviously heal from those emotional issues or health issues. So for the majority of the people going to QHHT therapy sessions around the world, they are there trying to seek healing. But also trying to, find context, understand context about where they've been potentially as a soul and what their life path is going forward as well. But now I just want to play you a short clip of Delores Cannon actually discussing Atlantis and some of the information that's kind of come through about this mystical place.
Well, whenever Atlantis went down, a lot of them, some of them went to Egypt, the survivors, and to other places, but some of them went underground. And there's an entire cities all throughout. There's all kinds of tunnels and transportation systems that link them all together. Some of the trains and things down there can go 3,000 miles an hour to link the cities together. There's like a sun inside the earth that lights everything. So they have light, they have lakes, they have water, they have everything they need. And there's animals down there that do not exist on the surface of the earth. They have live computers, if you want to say that. This is in my second volume of The Convoluted Universe. It talks about the underground cities. They have computers that we can't even approach, that can create and do anything they want. And the people are so advanced, they have no desire to come to the surface. They have everything they need down there. They've been down there for thousands and thousands of years. And they're much more advanced than we are because there's no wars, there's no violence. But yeah, there's civilizations under the surface of the earth. And people say, well, it can't be, there's only the magma. It's not. No one has ever gone, I think how many miles it said they've gone into the surface of the earth. They've never gone to where the underground cities are. They're much deeper than that. But they're all connected with tunnels. It's a lot of things I've discovered. There are entrances under most of the monuments in the world, especially under pyramids. There are entrances to it that have been discovered, but a lot of times they are guarded because they don't want people to go down there. And it's not advised. You wouldn't be able to go down there unless they would invite you anyway. But there are entrances all over the planet in and out of these underground cities. They're real. But it's not advised to go exploring around these things because they're heavily guarded. But I've written about all of this. It's in my books anyway.
Well, we're just getting your beautiful message out there.
Okay.
Do any of them come to visit us or come to heal us?
They can, but they don't want to. They'd rather stay away from us. Even the ETs are afraid of us, the extraterrestrials. We are isolated over here in this part of the galaxy on purpose. Earth is a young planet, and we're put over here in quarantine, so to speak, in this part of the galaxy on purpose. They don't want us to contaminate the rest of the universe. We're the ones that are violent. We're the ones that are the negative ones, and they're really afraid of us.
So as you just heard, she had a lot of information discussing, what happened to some of the survivors of Atlantis. And it seems that, Atlantis degraded over time through various natural disasters. But there was a point when the natural disasters became so great the whole civilization completely disappeared. But the fascinating aspect is, where did some of these survivors go? And maybe they resettled in places like Egypt and South America, which is, really, really rich with kind of quite amazing advanced civilizations that are kind of still visible to this day. So a lot of the buildings, a lot of the architecture are these echoes from the Atlantean past. And even more, crazy is the idea of like some of these civilizations breaking away and then finding a home underneath the earth, like in the crust of the earth. So then you can start to ask questions in terms of the legends of the various civilizations being underground. Are these then linked to Atlanteans, survivors of this ancient civilization finding a home down there? And have we been told a lie in terms of like, what constitutes the earth? Because we're always really told it's really dense sphere. And then as you get close to the center, it's just like molten volcanic, molten core. So it sounds very, very hostile. But do we have it completely wrong, or are we being lied to on this? And is it they're more like an internal sun, and it's more of a honeycomb structure with various cave networks, which allow various potentially animals, plant life, and even humanoids to live down there and thrive? I mean, I have heard stories of inner Earth civilizations before, and there's this whole concept that actually living on the surface of the Earth where we do is quite a chaotic environment to be in, because you have like natural disasters in terms of earthquakes. You can have asteroids, tornadoes, and hurricanes, depending where you are on this surface of the Earth. So actually being inside the Earth would be a safer, more protected place to be, and you'd be at less affected by natural disasters potentially. So that's briefly some of the information that Delores Cannon brought forward. Again, you can reference a lot of her. There's loads of videos on YouTube where she sort of talks about Atlantis. But there's also quite a lot of information in her books. I've only read about 2, I think, of her books, but I know she's got quite a lot. And I think on occasions that she's spoken about Atlantis at length because she's had clients come to her and, be regressed. And she found, a lot of health conditions or emotional issues are stemming from that period of time. But I guess one of the big precursors to Delores Cannon, her work, her information, that idea of regression, that idea of past lives, the first person to really popularize that would be Edgar Cayce. And I became a big fan of his a few years ago after reading, one of his books, the actual biography that was written by a friend of his. And what's fascinating about it is that he really struggled with this talent that he had of basically being set in a trance and being able to ask questions on literally anything from, physical healing through to metaphysics, through to ancient history, and he could answer it. Essentially, he was like tapped into some really divine conduit of information. But he actually, in real life, in physical life, when he wasn't in a trance, was a devoted Christian. And he really, really struggled with this side of his life in the beginning and kind of thought it was demonic and was really worried about what he was involved in. But as his life went on, he got more and more comfortable with, some of the talents that he was able to bring forward to humanity. For the majority of the time, he was called upon by people, by individuals to help with their healing. And it was only through that then he started to delve more into the topic of past lives and being Christian, mainstream Christian. Again, that was another thing that he struggled with because, Christianity and the idea of heaven was very much in his belief system. And then the idea of kind of past lives didn't really tally with the religious education he'd been given. And amazingly, a lot of the time when he was performing these healings, the actual participant, who had a health problem or emotional condition, didn't really need to physically be there with him. He could do it remotely. He would suggest a time and location where they should basically lie in bed so he could kind of locate them through time and space through some kind of psychic connection. But once he had that psychic connection and he was in a trance, he would then be able to impart information in terms of how they might heal from a particular health condition. But over time, he became more and more popular and people spoke about his talents and what he was capable of. And then people would then pay him to ask questions, not just on health, but to do with ancient civilizations. And this is when a lot of information to do with Atlantis started to come forward as well. Apart from that, obviously, some of the clients that kind of came forward would have had past lives in Lemuria or Atlantis. And again, this is when some of the Atlantean information kind of came through. Generally, he conducted sessions between 1923 to 1944, so a good sort of 2 decades. And again, he was always, at the beginning, very uncomfortable with his abilities and actually, on occasions, would be known to teach Sunday school and would read the Bible once a year. This is something that he would do throughout his life. So Christianity was very much part of his life, and sometimes he felt a conflict. Another part of the process when he would go into these trances that he wouldn't really remember anything he spoke about when he was in this trance. He was able to sort of self-hypnotize and get him into this mind state, but someone needed to be there present to actually vocally ask the questions and also to transcribe his words. So someone needed to be there to record what he was saying. But in terms of Edgar Cayce's information on the location of Atlantis, he pinpointed it around, again, the Atlantic Ocean stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to Gibraltar and was roughly the size of Eurasia. So it does start to sort of vaguely tally with Plato and what he was saying. And eventually Atlantis was divided into various islands due to, various earth changes. So it kind of indicates that potentially Atlantis wasn't, like with America at the moment, it's had like a 200-year history potentially, if you kind of believe the mainstream historical accounts. And now he's starting to kind of fall. But back then, like Rome, it lasted hundreds, if not thousands of years. Some of the information that came through also, he claims that the island Bimini is the remnants of Atlantis. So there's still certain aspects of Atlantis in terms of the landmass that still exists to this day. But for the majority, a lot of it is under the ocean and under the sea. But previous to its final destruction and loss, it existed for around 1 million years. And again, from Edgar Cayce's point of view, it was gradually degraded through internal conflicts and various natural disasters. And he located it in terms of a timeline between 50,000 and 10,000 BC. Even Edgar Cayce, through the course of his own regression through a trance-like state, he discovered he himself had past lives of Atlantis, so it was very much potentially tied up with his own soul journey as well. The idea of past lives and regression, it turns out that potentially many of the souls or individuals who are involved in Lemuria and Atlantis have reincarnated during this era. And the idea is that they're here to help usher in and expand conscious of humanity into sort of, again, talking about cyclical civilizations and potentially trying to solve some of the problems that Atlantis had or maybe Lemuria had, and which then counted towards its destruction. Hopefully this occasion, this cycle, we won't have to go through that. Maybe lessons have been learned and things have been healed. So hopefully now humanity doesn't have to go through the same destructive cycle that hopefully will be pushed to the next level in terms of consciousness. But it's a common trait where you hear about Atlanteans and that aptitude for science and technology. And it really echoes with our current society at the moment. And there is such reverence and obsession with the idea of materialism and science, mainstream science. It's, in its own way, it's become its own religion, I would argue. According to records, around about 700 readings had information to do with Atlantis through kind of regression and other aspects when he was in this trance-like state, which is an enormous amount of information. And from Edgar Cayce's point of view, or the channel, the divine channel that he's sort of tapped into, claims that Atlantis was the first instance of humans reincarnating into Earth, and they were represented by 5 races essentially. And again, as Plato was saying, they're very, very advanced in terms of like transportation. They had air travel, but they also had an aspect of technologies that we really haven't got to grips with in terms of like crystal technology, advanced healing techniques, utilizing crystals. He also discussed technologies such as television and recording equipment and the idea that they actually were able to control gravity. So that's not even, well, in terms of mainstream science, it's not part of mainstream science. I think it could be argued pretty convincingly that there's probably a lot of gravity control technologies maybe in the covert sector that we don't have access to. But what's strange is that, when Edgar Cayce was doing these readings, there was no element of like television existing in technology at that particular time. So the fact that this information is kind of coming through and it's not really influenced by his own understanding is quite amazing, and just goes to show that, television is not a creation of now, that it has probably existed, for eons. Through reading and researching this topic, I've always found it slightly hazy in terms of the Atlanteans' spirituality and their connection to consciousness. And I know Sarah Breskman's work, which I'm going to be talking a little bit later on, she really talks about, from some of the information that's come through the regression of her clients, about how cut off potentially the Atlanteans were. But from Edgar Cayce's information, according to him, then the Atlanteans had a capability of things like telepathy and telekinesis. But even though they had these advanced consciousness understandings, unfortunately, they still had conflict which raged between genetic groups. And interestingly, some of these genetic groups would have included things like dwarves and giants, and then average kind of humanoid people. So it's quite probable that it's not just like Homo sapiens as we are now that were walking around Atlantis, that it was a really diverse gene pool of different types of humanoids in terms of dwarfs and giants. And again, this really just ties into a lot of the legends and mythology that kind of comes through in stories to do with giants and dwarfs and, humanoids of all shapes and sizes. So again, maybe there's an Atlantean origin to this. But as the civilization matured and it grew, Atlantis started to divide into 2 ideologies. One side of the ideology was called the children of the law of one. The second Atlantean ideology, they were called the sons of Belor, and I hope I've said that right. where they were very much into self-gratification, materialism, the individual, and they ran very much counter to the mythology of the children of the law of one, who tended apparently to work more in harmony with nature. Going back to their technological capabilities, they very much, as a civilization, Atlantis was run by giant crystals. And this is a form of technology that, in terms of our society, really hasn't harnessed at all and has little understanding of. If we do, I guess these sort of things would be operating in covert circles, but it's definitely not accessible by society at large at the moment. But you have this real sort of dichotomy in terms of their technology, where you could perceive maybe crystal technologies being more harmonious to nature and working with humanity, but they also had incredibly destructive technology, including lasers and nuclear weaponry. Again, with many others, Cayce started to describe Atlantis' eventual fall and Atlantis being destroyed by various natural disasters. This was a combination of like moral decay, but then also a complete misuse of the technologies that they had. It was recorded many of the survivors moved to places like North and South America, Africa, Europe, and of course there's that very profound connection with Egyptian society, and apparently the Atlanteans, Atlantis, really transformed that area, and Atlantean knowledge is still preserved to this day in Egypt, and this again was confirmed by some of Edgar Cayce's readings. Some of the more fantastical historical accounts of Atlantis, I mean, these weren't an overly spiritual civilization. It seems they had conflicts, they had war. And one of these conflicts, one of these wars was involving massive animals who were trying to invade Atlantis. And eventually Atlantis was able to defeat them using technology, whether this is kind of laser weaponry or nuclear weaponry, I don't know. But according to Edgar Cayce, this is kind of part of the Atlantis story. Going back to Plato, majority of the, source of his information probably came from oral history. So, stories being passed down through the generations. But then also he maybe had access to ancient records, either in, ancient Greece or Egypt or other civilizations. Maybe these records still exist now, but they've been hidden under lock and key in covert circles. I don't know. But there's a real difference in some of the information in terms of their source. So, Plato's a very physical of the 3D world. And now we're bringing into the mix, ideas of like regression, past lives, channeled information from Edgar Cayce. So it's a completely different stream of information. And therein lies the problem in terms of the mainstream, because it's that acceptance of channeled information or past life regression. Mainstream science doesn't recognize it. So we'd always completely discount that information. So all we really have to go on is Plato. And obviously it's very, very difficult to confirm some of the information he spoke about. I guess you could say that Edgar Cayce's work really widely popularized the idea of Atlantis through people's soul journey, through people's various incarnations. And can we argue maybe this information is more accurate than things like Plato's work or other scholars? Because a lot of the time their work is, passed down orally from generation to generation, or it's written down in ancient text, maybe in a different language. Is the distortions when that work is actually translated? Are you missing aspects of the information due to the translation? And so, Edgar Cayce's work potentially is a direct connection to a person's soul journey, but still there could be distortions. I mean, through Edgar Cayce, there could be distortions, something not being translated correctly through the channeled information. And if maybe someone being regressed in particular, hypnotist is maybe influencing the information as well. So there is potential for distortions in terms of those regression techniques as well. I guess it's always discernment in any type of information, wherever it comes from. There's always going to be an element of distortion, and to be aware of that. So not get too attached to things, but just sort of see things in the broader picture, to take influence and take note of all aspects of information. So just to recap, to summarize, in terms of the source of information that I'm bringing into this podcast, very much Plato is the granddaddy who sort of really sparked off the whole imagination around Atlantis, and then various other scholars kind of after him. But now, we move over to sort of Edgar Cayce, and this is very much channeled information from past incarnations. And then you're moving on to Delores Cannon as well. But we have a unique perspective now coming through a lady called Sarah Breskman, who does a lot of QHHT healing. She trained under Delores Cannon, has worked very, very closely with the wider family of the canons. But she's very, very active now. She's writing books about it. She's doing videos on YouTube. She's appearing at conferences. And what's kind of unique about her information now is that we have more context, particularly to do with science and technology. So some of the sciences and technologies, the information that was coming through in Plato's time or Edgar Cayce's time, we didn't really have a reference point about what they were. Now we do, because our civilization is that bit more advanced. It could be argued that our consciousness is that bit more advanced. This idea of regressions, these ideas of QHHT are becoming more and more adopted by the wider populace. Now we're getting to the real meat of the podcast. I recently read Sarah's book on Atlantis and I devoured it incredibly quickly. I found it really fascinating, and the information that was coming through her clients really tallies with what's going on at the moment and some of the challenges humanity is facing at the moment. And yes, at points, some of the information that's kind of coming through is at odds with what maybe Plato said or maybe what Edgar Cayce said. So yeah, maybe there is distortions with their work, or maybe it wasn't translated properly. But yeah, you could also argue potentially that some of Sarah Breskman's work is maybe distorted. There is a possibility for hypnotherapists to maybe influence the information that's kind of coming through. I'm sure she does her due diligence and tries to be as methodical as possible, but sometimes that can happen. But just bringing a bit more woo-woo into the subject, the idea of distortion of like historical events. I have started, it's been a concept that's been running around in my mind. Obviously, we know whatever we do now in the present, influences the future. But, maybe time is not this, set thing, linear thing, that it is very, very fluid. You always hear, certain spiritual circles that, time's happening all at once. Time is a human construct. But, is there a possibility what we're doing now influences the past as well, that time is really quite malleable? And does this then tie into the idea of the Mandela effect and why people remember things slightly differently? So whatever we're doing now in the present moment could also be, affecting the past. So maybe aspects of information do change and morph over time in some way. So that's another aspect to this to bring into when you're talking about ancient civilizations and kind of what happened. Maybe there are different timelines that are flying around. Anyway, that's just something to be aware of. It's something I've been thinking of. Anyway, let's return back to Sarah. Her full name is Sarah Breskman Cosme, and she wrote this book, A Hypnotist's Journey to Atlantis, Eyewitness Accounts of Our Ancient History. And this book came roughly out in 2020 and very much put her on the map. And again, a caveat, it really does challenge some of the existing information to do with Atlantis and Lemuria, and the fact that they were completely different civilizations occurring at completely different times, maybe thousands, if not tens of thousands years apart. But in terms of her information, this is the big difference, that actually they were coexisting at the same time, but they were just in different locations on the planet. I was starting to consider like Edgar Cayce's information, where he spoke about Atlantis and the ideologies, and you had the children of the law of one and the children of Balor, and that the Balor, they were more focused on materialism and technology, and the law of one children were more focused on spirituality. Maybe there's a blurring of information here, because very much Sarah's describing Atlanteans very obsessed with technology and materialism, but it was the Lemurians who were the ones that were kind of more aligned with like nature and had more a spiritual underpinning to their civilization. So again, maybe, I don't know, I'm just arguing potentially maybe Edgar Cayce is viewing aspects of Lemuria and Atlantis as all one thing. But now do we have more perspective with Sarah's information where, actually children of Balor, they're Atlantis, and the children of Laura 1, they're a part of Lemuria. I don't know. I'm just trying to sort of decipher through the fog of this information. But yeah, Sarah Breskman's work, she very, some of the information that's coming through her clients and what she's written down, very much arguing the fact that Lemuria existed alongside Atlantis. And it could be the fact that these titles and names are just very much interchangeable. I don't know. But this is, a big difference of Sarah's work that I wanted to kind of point out. But yeah, again, according to Sarah, Atlantis did not have ability for telepathy or telekinesis, and that was an aspect of Edgar Cayce's work that said they did have that capability. Sarah's own personal journey is very similar to any other person who eventually gets involved in the alternative sector of like healing or conspiracy. You know, they suffered. She suffered as a child, had various kind of issues, personal issues, and she found that talking therapy, traditional talking therapy, really wasn't helping. And eventually, she got older. She went on to try and study psychology to kind of help with her own life, or help with her own healing. But what she found that was actually changing her thinking patterns really dramatically altered her life. And eventually, she had a complete dissolution, a complete turnaround from mainstream psychology in the pharmaceutical industry, which, you know, when you go on to sort of study these things in the mainstream, these are the solutions that you're given. You know, patients were given cocktails of drugs, and she was just shocked on the amount of drug experimentation on very vulnerable people with these psychological conditions. So she completely turned her back on the mainstream, you know, psychological industry, and eventually moved over into hypnosis. And she just started to discover actually the hypnosis was really results driven and very much helped people, you know, lose weight or quit smoking. And naturally just started to move into areas of like past life regression. And at that point, she really started to understand that this showed significant healing results in helping people with various physical conditions and emotional conditions. In Sarah's book, she wrote about how some of the information to do with Atlantis started to come through. And it was really at a time when she was really finding a groove with QHHT. She was doing really well in it. She was having lots of really good results with various clients. And the Atlantis information just started to unfold in front of her eyes. And it all started with a friend, a lady called Jen. Sarah discusses her friendship with Jen, who was a young mother. And apparently in their friendship, they never really discussed anything paranormal or woo-woo. It's very rare that she talked about her work with the QHHT healing. It was only after Jen starting to experience really severe swelling on the brain, she eventually went to a doctor and then was diagnosed with a tumour. So it was at that point that Sarah decided to offer her services of regression to Jen, who'd never really been regressed before, to see if it would help the condition. So after a series of regressions, amazingly, they discovered that she was descended from Lemurian royalty who was actually imprisoned in Atlantis after the destruction of the ancient land of Lemuria. What they found out after other regressions is that Jen had had a remembrance of this particular past life in Lemuria and Atlantis, and actually tried to speak about it in other past lives, but unfortunately was just perceived as being crazy and not believed. And because of the information that was coming through was so fantastical, you know, she was really ostracized in those lifetimes and actually imprisoned for some of her beliefs. But it was kind of destined, you know, for Jen and Sarah to have this experience. You know, now they can bring forth this information because people's consciousness is that much greater. And therefore, when she's talking about these concepts, she's not going to immediately put on a psychiatric ward or she's going to be imprisoned in some way. So bringing forward some of the ideas of these ancient civilizations and actually what happened, you know, will help heal humanity and, you know, bring it to the next step. And what they found purely through telling the truth dramatically healed Jen's condition. And, you know, the result of her health condition was because she was unable to tell the truth. But it wasn't just Lemuria and Atlantis, you know, in terms of the incarnations that kind of came through. They also understood that Jen very much had an extraterrestrial soul path as well, soul journey. And she was able to confirm, you know, how much in terms of extraterrestrials had seeded resources and humanity itself on this planet. After the very powerful and profound experiences with the regressions of Jen to do with Atlantis and Lemuria and all the information that kind of came forward, she started to uncover a pattern because she became very popular and many more clients started to come to her for regression. And what she found that many of them, majority of them also had experiences in Atlantis and Lemuria. And these lifetimes had actually really affected their everyday lives and created, you know, fear and insecurity and a real lack of self-worth. And she found that healing these incarnations really dramatically healed these people. Similar to Edgar Cayce's readings, Sarah also confirmed that many Atlanteans who existed are reincarnating now. And it's in a way to really avoid past mistakes. And many of the modern issues that we're having in the mainstream at the moment really echo Atlantean times. You know, things like critical race theory, sexism, issues to do with technology, science, AI, medicine, war, all tallies with Atlantis. Through Sarah's continuous regressions, she started to build a picture of Atlantis and Lemuria. And again, her information was coming through these two civilizations in the end are existing, coexisting at the same time. And the Atlanteans were very much, thought themselves quite superior, were obsessed with technology, were obsessed with science, had a very hierarchical system. Even in Delores Cannon's work, she discussed the aspect of Atlantean cruelty. The polar opposite was Lemuria. They were dark-skinned. The Atlanteans were white-skinned. They had blonde hair. The Lemurians were a deeply spiritual people, and they actually had a matriarchal system, so it's very different to the hierarchical patriarchy that Atlanteans had. So the lessons for Atlanteans in this time construct, now, is that they need to learn equality and to release these traumas. But again, through the regressions, they were able to understand that the Atlanteans very much looked down on the Lemurians. In terms of the physicality of Atlantis, the look, it's very similar to some of the information, coming from Plato or Edgar Cayce. Even Sarah's work, it has a lot of similarities. They talk about concentric circles of islands with like canals in between. I assume these canals would be used for transportation, but maybe there could be a spiritual or technological purpose for them as well. According to Sarah's information, it was a very hierarchical structure. So the middle concentric circle would have all the elites, and as you moved out from them, there'd be kind of high class people. Then the concentric circle outside of them would be essentially like a middle class. Outside of them, working class. To the very peripheries of the circle would be essentially a slave class. But through Sarah's regression, it very much reinforces the idea that history repeats. We have cycles until lessons are learned. We always hear about, karma, your own soul's journey, and you're cursed to end up repeating the same mistakes unless you actually heal these things. Otherwise, you'll just keep repeating it. It's that on a macro level. So as a society, as a consciousness, we haven't healed these aspects of ourselves. So therefore, our civilizations keep going through these traumatic periods. So therefore, if we collectively solve this, then we won't have to go through those catastrophes anymore. Sarah very much has hope for the future due to her, the experiences of healing these previous Atlanteans. And a lot of the time, they actually need to learn to think independently. And this is an issue we're finding now, where you have this group think, this group thought, this collective narratives that we're told that we have to follow. And again, this just ties into now and just discovering the similarities between this ancient Atlantis and things like modern pandemics, which we've, experienced over these last few years and maybe potentially going to experience more of. And we're really dealing with a collective karma that's led by reincarnation, trying to solve these problems. And because of the chaos of the world and the exterior environment and the 3D, people are really being led to look inward to kind of solve these problems and rediscover our inner voice and not to be dictated to by the exterior environment. And this all kind of plays into ideas now of like social media censorship. And this all plays into the part of like finding inner reflection, finding inner, thought and the inner voice, and basically regaining people's true power. Much of the information that's coming from Sarah's clients really reiterates, Atlantis' downfall and the fact that it occurred due to the misuse of powerful technology, medicine. And it just really tallies with the current reality we're experiencing now. And again, I'm going to use coded language. We've all experienced this thing called the bat sniffles, and then people were told to take multiple bat sniffle, medications, without really truly realizing what the side effects were. Maybe there was a nefarious agenda behind these medicines that people were told, pressurized into taking. And they still haven't been fully realized. So I know in my own network, I'm quite aware of people dying suddenly. There's a lot of cancers around. There's a lot of general illness. And collectively, I think that's happening to a lot of people. And for me, I kind of put it down to a lot to do with like mainstream medicine, and especially what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years plays a huge part from my point of view, my own perspective. Bizarrely, what Sarah was uncovering with some of her regressions, that the Atlanteans went through something similar. They had an illness, and the authorities then provided a particular medicine. But this medicine, they were starting to tinker with DNA. They were introducing animal DNA into the injected medicine. But unfortunately, due to this like tinkering and introduction of these strange animal genetics into this medicine, really started to affect people's children. Children were being born with animal-like features or animal type, abilities that humans don't have. This aspect to her information gets really wild because there's loads of mythology, isn't there, in terms of like animals being fused with humans. You get like Greek mythology, you get minotaurs, which are, is a man with a bull's head, I think. Mermaids, you get faun, which, famously in the Chronicles of Narnia, which is like half goat, half man. There's all this like hybrid information that's kind of interwoven into our mythologies. So, you then can start to ask the question, do these mythologies of like humans fused with animals relate back to this situation, this scenario where the authorities in Atlantis are tinkering with people's DNAs, and what they're finding is like future generations are then having issues with their DNA in terms of having animal-like features or like capabilities that humans just don't have because they have this animal genetics. Really wild. It makes me think, if you contrast that against the information of Edgar Cayce, it could be a completely different scenario that maybe Sarah's information hasn't got to, or maybe she didn't write about it. But Edgar Cayce in discussion of like large animals trying to invade Atlantis. And I don't know whether there's like a commonality again or a similarity between, humans being born with animal-like features and this story of large animals. I don't know. But I'm just putting that out there as like a thought form. Once these children were being born with these animal-like features or abilities, they found that they were quite violently shunned by the Atlantean society because they were, not a particularly loving group of people. And she goes into quite a lot of detail with this, but eventually a lot of these animals, half human, half animals, were essentially rounded up, put in a central location, and then killed en masse just to sort of try and get rid of the problem. With the current scenario with all these medicines that were pressurized upon the populace, I think there are a lot of similarities with Sarah's information, what happened then and what's happening now. I really hope it's not as devastating with that. That's pretty wild, people sort of starting to grow animal features. But yeah, I still think what has gone on has been a complete catastrophe from my own experience. Maybe you think differently, but yeah, it does seem that there's a lot of similarities between the two civilizations at the moment. But before I finish up this podcast and conclude and summarize my thoughts, I just want to return back to Jen, Sarah's friend. And again, we already mentioned she discovered she was royalty in Lemuria. And again, they had a very completely different society contrasted with Atlantis. It was matriarchal. They had a benevolent queen who ruled over Lemuria, which is strange because you always hear in the modern day now, it's always democracy, democracy, democracy. And it just appears that, we have so little democracy, it's untrue. It's like an illusion. So their society was centered on being ruled by a queen, a benevolent queen. But the new royalty, babies were born using a type of artificial insemination. So the current ruling monarch would get, pregnant through artificial insemination. And so they would be the future ruler, the future heir for the kingdom of Lemuria, essentially. So the royal family only really consisted of 3 individuals. You would have had a princess, and then you would have had the current ruling monarch, I guess would have been her 30s, 20s, or middle age at least. And then a queen mother who would be a monarch that used to rule, and the whole lineage would be propped up through artificial insemination. And I was reading that, and it's got a lot of similarities as a sci-fi show on Apple TV here in the UK called The Foundation. It might be on other streaming services depending where in the world. But the royalty there, they're all male, but it's a similar thing. It's sort of through genetic engineering, they create the next heir. But it's a bit more dystopian. In this matriarchal situation, it's very different. But it just makes me think whether that concept is an echo from potentially Lemuria. I don't know. I'm just like postulating here, but it was interesting. To modern day ears, the idea of being ruled by a monarchy could sound really, really jarring. But according to Sarah and some of the information coming through her clients, it was quite successful because again, the monarchy, they were quite benevolent. And again, relating it back to sort of sci-fi, there's an aspect in Dune, especially the second film, where you get Paul, who's supposed to be like, the next coming, his mum, Jess, she becomes the Reverend Mother. She sort of drinks this blue worm juice, and then she then is connected to all the Reverend Mothers from all the different generations. So she had this expansive consciousness. So it was quite similar sounding to what occurred in Lemuria, that they would have, past life knowledge of all the other monarchs before them. And again, Lemurians were very different to the Atlanteans. They were blonde haired and they had fair skinned, and the Lemurians were very, very dark skinned. And I think in the book, I seem to remember her saying they were potentially probably closely visually related to Australian Aboriginals. So they look quite similar. And again, they're very, very spiritually advanced. They work very much in better harmony with nature compared to the Atlanteans. And they were able to harness advanced crystal healing, and they utilized these like red crystals. And because of this use of crystal technology, Lemurians never got sick and they never seemed to die from any particular illness. And this then ties into, why Lemuria potentially disappeared and they had their own disasters. And this, information is very unique to Sarah's client information. It's nowhere else. Again, you have Atlantis and Lemuria existing at the same time. And the Atlanteans became aware of the Lemurians' super amazing immunity. They never seemed to get sick, and they wanted to know why. Why was this? So the Atlanteans sent an emissary. They sent a group of them to try and discover the secrets. And the Lemurians knew that technologically and spiritually, the Atlanteans were just not good people. So they refused to give their secrets to do with technology or healing. And because the Lemurians just refused to help them, refused to give them any technology or healing techniques, the Atlanteans then went on to use their advanced weaponry to basically cause disasters in Lemuria. But unfortunately, before all of this happened, they went in, they killed the Queen Mother, they killed the ruling monarch, the Queen, and they ended up kidnapping the princess. And after this, they created earthquakes and tidal waves, which then went on to destroy the Lemurian community. So it seems the military capabilities of the Atlanteans were pretty advanced if they're able to create earthquakes, able to create tidal waves. And it completely swept away the entire of Lemuria. And just relating it back to Jen, so it turns out Jen was actually the princess that was kidnapped. And she was then imprisoned in, the Atlantean society. Unfortunately, this princess or Jen, that experience didn't end well, and it ended up her being tortured repeatedly for years and years and years. And the Atlanteans constantly trying to get her to give up secrets to do with their technology and healing technologies. Eventually, the Atlanteans then sort of succeeded and stopped torturing her, but she was pretty much imprisoned for the rest of her life. She was given a little bit of autonomy. She had her own apartment, but was heavily controlled in terms of what she could do. I mean, that is a really, really epic past life story to have, to be this imprisoned princess from a destroyed Lemuria. But what's mad about that whole situation, that whole story can kind of bring in the modern world, and then an idea of a sort of distrust of women in power, and how potentially, obviously it sounded Lemuria as a thriving civilization. It worked really well, this matriarchal system. But because, Lemuria is destroyed, in a small way, I don't know, the collective consciousness of humanity sort of blame these matriarchal women for allowing this to happen. So it sort of seeded ideas of distrusting women into the collective consciousness. I mean, I've no idea if this information is true, but yeah, it does point to a reason why, our world, if we look back over the last few hundred years, has been so patriarchal. Was it a knee-jerk reaction to this Lemurian wound where they were blamed for this catastrophe that occurred, even though it wasn't their fault? So again, I can kind of go back to, the scenarios we're having now in terms of the whole kind of race situation, struggling with technology, struggling with mainstream science, struggling with medicine, the gender roles is always in play as well. There's so many echoes, potentially what we're dealing with now and what happened at Atlantis and Lemuria. But I really recommend Sarah's book. It's a great read. I know she's got another one on the way to do with King Arthur. And I know King Arthur and that whole mythology of Avalon has really come up in my life. So I'm quite looking forward to having a read of that when it comes out. So, in conclusion, in summary, again, so you've heard a slightly different take on Atlantis and Lemuria. I've really concentrated on the more channeled aspects of the information, starting from Edgar Cayce and Delores Cannon, and then finally Sarah Breskman. And there's a fascinating correlation. There's so many levels of all the information, and it does seem there are echoes of some of the traumas and the scenarios that happened during those civilizations are playing out now. We're playing out the collective karma, the collective trauma of everything. Particularly for me, science and technology. I know my day job, I'm very much involved with technology all the time, and I have a very uneasy relationship with it. Because there was a period of time it wasn't so dominant in our lives, but now it's gradually taking over more and more. I know you probably feel it as well, having a mobile phone, smartphone, and how screen time is so dominant in our lives and things. So I think there's a real adjustment that needs to happen with humanity and like what's happening and how we're being controlled by this technology. And it just feels that, technology is the be all and end all. It's just that we're marveling at it way too much, and we're just forgetting what it is to be human. We're forgetting the spiritual, we're forgetting the divine nature of humanity and living on this planet. So we're all really playing out the collective unhealed societal patterns again. I mean, hopefully this time we can push humanity over the edge and come to a more glorious future that's away from these cycles of boom and bust. In terms of Sarah's content, yes, you can read her book. She also has a YouTube channel. She posts up relatively regularly her client sessions. They can be really fascinating. She's quite active on the conference circuit, so you can go see her there. She does do healing sessions online. They are incredibly expensive though, but yeah, you can find her on her own website. I really recommend Edgar Cayce's biography. It just really goes to show the extent of how many people he healed. And, I just think that information that people transcribed of all the healings that he suggested are so relevant today because, people are crying out for alternative ways to heal. So it's obviously a real goldmine, a resource of alternative healing potentially. I think now we're living through this real shift in how we interact with information, where you would have the very 3D vocal written down information, potentially, people like Plato are talking about, or other scholars. But there's this new wave of people accepting more and more of, channeled information or information that's come from regressions. Divination. There's a lot of people now on the internet using divination to decode the news. Tarot cards, there's remote viewing, there's pendulums, there's all these tools we can utilize to try and explore this reality. And I think it's been taken on by people more and more, and they're becoming more and more comfortable with it. I mean, you talk about Atlantis and Lemuria, they feel so far away, so distant, and particularly with some of the technologies and the spiritual understandings. But through that reincarnation cycle, what if you call it? I mean, maybe we still have a limited understanding how it actually operates, but it seems maybe we have all these previous Atlanteans and Lemurians going through the same emotional patterns, the same societal karmic patterns, traumas that need to be healed. So in many ways, Atlantis and Lemuria, even though it could be tens of thousands of years in the past, has never felt closer, purely through those collective traumas that we're now playing out and hopefully healing. So that about concludes this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on this odyssey through the channeled, strange information of Atlantis and Lemuria. For me, I think there's something definitely going on in terms of playing out some of the past traumas of these ancient civilizations. But you can catch me on reconsidersimon.com. I'm on all major podcast platforms and trying to get myself on all video streaming services like Rumble, BitChute, YouTube, Odyssey. I'm on Substack. If you're feeling fruity, please do try and donate on one of the many links in the description. And I'll speak to you soon. Take care, wherever you are in the world. Bye-bye.